The needle hit my arm before I even cleared the airlock. Not medicine, not a vaccine. It was the standard Galactic Compact Chemical Survey they ran on every new arrival at Vithara Station, pulling a sample of my biology to cross-reference against their database of known species. The automated scanner beeped once, paused for 3 full seconds, and then beeped again in a different tone. A tone I would later learn meant unclassified organism. I was 22 years old, standing in a corridor wide enough to park a cargo truck sideways, surrounded by beings whose shadows alone were bigger than me. And the station's own intake system did not know what to do with me. I thought that was funny. I still do. My name is Claire Novak. I was born in a small town in northern England where it rained more days than it did. Not where my father fixed engines for a living and my mother taught children how to read. I grew up rough and curious and never once afraid of a thing bigger than me, which meant I was never afraid of anything, because everything was bigger than me. I joined the Earth Defense Corps at 17. By 20, I was ranked top of my unit in hand-to-hand combat assessment. By 21, I had filed 6 formal applications to the Interstellar Combat Academy on Vithara Station. The first 5 were returned with a polite automated response, noting that the Academy admitted species of documented combat heritage only. The 6th application I sent with a 12-page supplemental file detailing 3,000 years of human warfare, including subsections on psychological resilience, physiological adaptability under extreme conditions, and a personal note at the end that said, "Try me." They accepted me 6 weeks later. I was the first human ever admitted. I remember stepping fully onto the station and just stopping for a moment, taking it in. Vithara was enormous in a way that made numbers useless. It had been built and rebuilt over 400 years by a rotation of compact species, each adding sections according to their own architectural instincts, so the result was a structure that looked like something you would get if you gave 20 different civilizations a pile of metal and told them to build a fortress without ever talking to each other. Corridors that arched and curved and descended at angles that made no gravitational sense. Doorways cut for bodies 3 times my height, lighting that shifted across spectrums I could not fully perceive, in colors that my brain translated poorly. The smell alone was almost too much, a layered living scent of 100 different biologies sharing recycled air. And the cadets. I saw my first group of them within 2 minutes of stepping off the transport dock. Calith warriors, 4 of them, moving in a loose cluster through the main corridor. They stood close to 8 feet tall, built from layered muscle wrapped in a natural exoskeleton that covered their shoulders and upper spine like armor that had grown there because it needed to. Their movements were precise and unhurried in the way that things move when they are never uncertain about their own strength. One of them glanced at me as they passed. It was not hostility in that look. It was the brief, untroubled curiosity you might give a strange insect on a windowsill. Then he looked away and kept walking. I watched them go. I noted the way their weight shifted when they moved. I noted the reach of their arms and the width of their stance. I filed it all away in the back of my head where I kept things I might need later. The intake officer who processed my arrival was a Vreth, smaller than the Calith but no less striking, with 4 arms arranged symmetrically around a narrow torso and a face that expressed almost nothing, in any way I could read. She ran through the documentation with professional speed, pausing only once when my physical assessment readout generated a result she apparently had not seen before. She looked at the number on the screen, looked at me, looked back at the screen. "Your pain tolerance threshold," she said in the flat translated voice of her comm unit. "Tests at 3.8 times the compact standard baseline. Is that a problem?" I asked. She paused again. "No," she said. But she said it in a way that suggested she was not entirely sure. I was assigned to Barrack 7, Unit 3, a mixed cohort of 12 cadets drawn from 6 different species. When I arrived with my kit bag over one shoulder, the room went quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Not the silence of hostility, exactly. More the silence of a group of people recalibrating, updating their expectations in real time. I found my bunk, dropped my bag on it, and looked around. There was a Calith named Oren, who held the unofficial record for the fastest knockout in training history. There was a Vreth cadet named Sav, who communicated in layered pheromone bursts that the translation tech only partially captured, meaning about 30% of what he said was lost in transmission, and he had apparently decided that was acceptable. There was a Lethii cadet, tall and silver-skinned, who I later learned had been trained since childhood in a combat discipline so old that its founding texts predated human, written language by 1,000 years. There were others. Every one of them carried themselves with the easy confidence of someone who had been told, their whole life that they were exceptional. I sat down on my bunk and started unpacking. My kit was simple. Training clothes, 2 pairs. A set of hand wraps in 2 different weights. A repair kit for equipment. A photograph of my parents standing outside the workshop, where my father had worked for 30 years, squinting into the sun on a bright afternoon, with the comfortable ease of people who do not think to arrange their faces for photographs. A paper notebook, plain, the kind you can buy in any stationery shop, with a pen clipped to the cover. I set these things on the small shelf above the bunk in the order I would need them. Training clothes first. Notebook last, within reach. The bunk itself was designed for a being larger than me. The mattress was long, and the pillow was at the wrong angle, and the height of the shelf required me to stretch slightly to reach it. I noted these things the same way I noted everything else, as information about the environment I was in, not as complaints about it. You work with the room you are given. You always have. No one spoke to me that first evening. I did not mind. I had grown up in a household where silence was not a punishment, but just a mood, and I had learned early that the best response to being ignored was to become impossible to ignore in a way you chose, rather than a way others forced on you. I opened my training journal and I started writing down everything I had observed in my first 2 hours on the station. I filled 4 pages before lights down. I heard Oren say something in low Caliph to the cadet in the bunk beside him. The translation patch on my collar caught about half of it. The half it caught included the phrase soft outer tissue and a statistical reference to average human recovery time. There was quiet laughter. I kept writing. The betting pool, I found out 3 days later from a maintenance worker named Cal, who had taken a liking to me in the way that neutral parties sometimes do, had me lasting 3 weeks. Some of the more optimistic entries said 4. One anonymous entry said 2 days. The pool was substantial enough that it had its own administration system, which I thought said more about the station than it did about me. On day 4, I heard the name for the first time. I was in the main training observation gallery, watching a senior cohort run a live combat exercise, taking notes on movement patterns and recovery stances. 2 Caliph cadets were sitting 1 row ahead of me, discussing something in low voices. The translation patch worked well enough. They were talking about the end-of-term championship bracket, and specifically about whether anyone in the current senior cohort had even a theoretical chance against the Vreth fighter who had won it for the past 3 consecutive years. One of them said no, the other agreed. Then one of them said the name, Drethek of the Morn Cluster. Just a name, but the way they said it made the air in the gallery feel slightly different afterward, like a pressure change. I looked up from my notebook. "Who is Drathek?" I asked. They both turned to look at me. There was a pause in which I could see them deciding whether the question deserved answer or whether they should simply turn back around. The one on the left, whom I had learned was named Kavith, seemed to decide that answering was more efficient than not. 11 years undefeated, he said. Informal challenge, open sparring, and cross-species exhibition. He currently holds the compact record for the shortest time to force submission in a ranked bout. He has broken opponents who were widely considered unbreakable. He is the closest thing this academy has ever produced to a complete fighter. I wrote the name in my notebook. I underlined it once. "Which ring does he train in?" I asked. Kavith looked at me for a moment with an expression that I could not fully translate but which felt something like pity mixed with discomfort. "You should focus on surviving your first month," he said, and turned back around. I underlined the name a second time. That night, lying in my bunk in the dark, I stared at the ceiling and thought about what I had gotten myself into. Not with fear, more with the deep, quiet pleasure of someone who has found exactly the kind of problem they have been looking for. Outside the barracks window, the starfield was constant and cold and enormous. I had come a very long way from the town where I grew up. I intended to make the distance count. The station made sounds at night that I had not expected. Not mechanical sounds, the hum of recyclers and the distant rhythm of the maintenance systems. Those I had anticipated, and they faded into background quickly enough. What I had not anticipated was the sound of the station settling for, if that is the right word for what a structure of this age and this size does as temperature differentials move through its older sections. It was a deep, intermittent sound, not alarming, but present. The sound of something very old continuing to exist. I lay in the dark and listened to it and thought about continuity. About how many generations of fighters had slept in rooms like this one, in different configurations of the same station, laying in the dark before the beginning of something. I was the first human to do it. That was real. But I was not the first young person to lie awake the night before their first full day, in a place that was larger and more complicated than anything they had trained for. feeling the mixture of excitement and clear-eyed awareness of difficulty that is the honest response to the beginning of a real challenge. That thought settled something in me that I had not known was unsettled. I was not doing something unprecedented in spirit. I was doing something unprecedented in location. The spirit of it had been done before, by every person who had chosen a hard thing and then lain awake the night before starting it, knowing exactly what they were choosing. I closed my eyes. I was already thinking about how to train for tomorrow. Somewhere deeper in the station, in a ring I had not yet found, the galaxy's most dangerous fighter was doing the same. Neither of us knew yet that we were already on a collision course, but the station knew. The station had been here 400 years, and it recognized the feeling. Something was about to change. My third week on the station, I lost 8 sparring matches in a single day. Not close losses, not learning experiences wrapped in the soft language of athletic development. I lost badly, clearly, and in ways that demonstrated a gap between me and every opponent I faced that felt less like a challenge to be closed and more like a law of physics. Oren put me on the floor in 11 seconds during our first official training bout. I got up. He looked at me the way you look at something you have already stopped worrying about, and that look told me more about the size of the gap than the 11 seconds had. I wrote everything down. I wrote the time of each bout, the technique that ended it, the body position I was in when I lost control of the exchange, the precise moment things went wrong. My notebook filled up fast. I started a second one. The other cadets stopped watching my matches by the end of week 2. There was nothing to observe. From their perspective, a human losing was not instructive. It was expected. I heard one of the Lethe cadets tell a junior instructor that sparring against me was pointless, because my technique had no transferable elements, meaning whatever I was doing could not teach them anything about how to fight other species, because no other species fought the way I did. The junior instructor agreed. I took that as useful data, though not in the way they intended. The thing about losing that much is that it forces you into a kind of clarity that winning never gives you. When you win, you learn what worked. When you lose, you learn what exists. You learn the true architecture of the problem. By the end of my third week, I had a cleaner picture of the actual gap between me and the other cadets than anyone in that barracks had of their own abilities, because most of them had never lost enough to need to understand themselves that precisely. I started arriving at the training rings 30 minutes before the official session start time and staying 40 minutes after. The facility staff noticed but said nothing. The rings were available, and the Academy's policy on independent training time was permissive. I ran the same drills over and over in the empty rings, talking to myself quietly as I worked, narrating what I was doing and why, a habit I had developed years earlier, because it forced me to be honest about the gap between what I thought I was doing and what I was actually doing. If you can describe a movement accurately in words, you understand it. If you cannot, you are working from instinct that has not been fully interrogated. My instincts were good. They were also human instincts, which meant they had been shaped by the particular pressures of Earth biology, and they did not always translate cleanly to fighting beings whose bodies were built on different principles. A feint that worked on a human opponent relied on the human tendency to track a fast movement with the eyes and the body simultaneously. Calith fighters tracked with their exoskeletal shoulder sensors first and their eyes second, which meant the timing of any feint had to be shifted by a margin my reflexes were not naturally calibrated for. I drilled the adjustment until it stopped feeling unnatural. Then I drilled it some more. I also started studying, which was something no one had specifically recommended, and which I did not announce. The Academy's archive held thousands of hours of recorded competition across a century of training history. I applied for access through the Standard Research Channel, noting my academic interest in cross-species combat methodology. The librarian who processed the request, a small quiet Lethi named Ren who worked the archive desk in the early mornings, looked at the scope of my request for a moment and then approved it without comment. I came to the archive every morning before my independent ring sessions, at a time when I was usually the only person there, and I watched recordings and took notes in my notebook. I watched every species fight, not just the Calith and the Vreth. I watched the smaller species, the faster ones, the ones whose combat tradition was built on terrain advantage or group tactics rather than individual physical dominance. I watched the oldest recordings in the archive, the competition footage from the early years of the Academy, when the compact was younger and the training methodologies were less refined, and the fighters were working things out in real time, the same way I was. I found it reassuring, those early recordings. Every polished system in that facility had once been someone's rough experiment. Every refined technique had once been a first attempt. I was in the archive early one morning in my 5th week, watching a recording of a Vreth fighter from 60 years ago who had developed an unusual counter to the standard Kalith rush pattern, when Ren appeared beside me and set a cup of something hot on the desk without a word. I looked at it. Then I looked at her. She had already moved back to her desk and was working through her own morning tasks with her characteristic quiet efficiency. I drank the cup. It tasted like nothing I could identify, but it was warm and the warmth was welcome. And I noted in the margin of my notebook, Archive Librarian, unexpected kindness, worth acknowledging. Instructor Seveth found me in the corridor outside Ring 3 on a Tuesday morning, sitting cross-legged on the floor with my second notebook open across my knees. She was retired from active competition, old enough that her exoskeleton had developed the dark, layered texture that indicated age in Kalith biology, like rings in old wood. She had a reputation among the cadets for being the harshest evaluator in the facility. The kind of instructor whose approval meant something specifically because it was so rarely given. Several senior cadets had described her as the person who had improved their technique more than any other instructor, and who had also made them cry, sometimes in the same session. She stopped in front of me and looked down at the notebook. "You chart your losses," she said. It was not a question. "Everyone," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "No other cadet in this facility keeps written records of their defeats. No other cadet loses this often," I said. Something moved in her expression. Not a smile exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something brief and almost involuntary that she closed off quickly. She tilted her head in the way that indicated, in Kalith body language, "A reassessment in progress." "Stand up," she said. I stood up. She studied me the way a builder studies a structure. Not with judgment, but with professional calculation, measuring stress points and load distribution. She walked slowly around me once. I let her. I stood with my hands at my sides and breathed steadily and waited. "What do humans do?" she said, "that no other species in this compact does?" I opened my mouth to answer and then closed it again. Because the first 3 answers that came to me were obvious answers. The kind of answers you give to a question you have not actually thought about. I did not think Seveth was asking for obvious answers. She was not a person who asked obvious questions. She waited. She seemed perfectly comfortable waiting. I thought about it for the rest of that morning and most of the afternoon. I went to the observation gallery and watched training sessions with new attention, trying to see not what the other cadets could do but what they could not do, or more precisely, what the architecture of their training assumed they would never need to do. I watched Kalith cadets spar and noted the clean, precise economy of their technique, every movement designed, every angle calculated, nothing wasted. It was extraordinary to watch. It was also, I realized slowly, a system. And systems had edges. I watched the Vreth coordinate in live drills using pheromone communication that worked faster than verbal language, their unit movements so synchronized they looked choreographed. Efficient beyond anything a human team could match. Also, I noted, deeply dependent on the integrity of the communication channel. Disrupt the channel, and the synchrony collapsed. I watched the Lethia move through forms that were so refined by generations of practice that they had become something close to art. Beautiful and precise and built on centuries of accumulated knowledge. Also, built on the assumption that the opponent would behave in ways the system anticipated. I watched all of it and I asked myself honestly, what do humans do that this is not? The answer, when it came all at once. We break our own rules. We adapt in real time to conditions we have never trained for. We feel pain, and we keep moving not because we have overridden the pain signal, but because we have decided, consciously and sometimes even cheerfully, that the pain is not the most important thing happening right now. We play, we improvise. We do things that make no rational sense from a tactical standpoint, and then we do them again with variations. We laugh at impossible situations, and the laughter is not a mask for fear. It is the actual response of a species that evolved finding some dark humor in the gap between how bad things are and how hard we are still trying anyway. Every other species in that gym was fighting in the way they had been trained to fight. They were executing systems. Good systems, brilliant systems, systems refined over centuries. But systems have edges, and at the edges they have gaps. And in the gaps something that does not follow the system has an advantage. I went back to my bunk and I filled 6 pages of my notebook with the new approach. I stopped trying to close the gap and started trying to make the gap irrelevant. The practical change was this. I stopped trying to match my opponents on their own terms. I stopped attempting the kind of clean technical fighting that the Academy's training was, built around the disciplined system of prepared responses to known attacks. Instead, I started fighting the way I had fought as a teenager in a town where nobody had ever heard of formal combat technique, which was to say, with complete attention to what was actually happening in front of me at this specific moment, in this specific exchange, against this specific opponent, with no attachment whatsoever to what was supposed to happen next. It sounds simple. It is not. Fighting without a system means fighting without a safety net. Every decision is real-time. Every response is built from scratch. The cognitive load is enormous, and it means you will sometimes do things that are objectively wrong. Things a trained fighter would never do. Things that work not because they are good technique, but because they are unexpected. And the unexpected, at the level of competition in that academy, was rarer, and therefore more valuable than technical perfection. Seveth began appearing at my training sessions without comment. She never instructed me directly in those early sessions. She watched. Occasionally she would make a small sound that I learned to distinguish. One sound for incorrect, a different sound for interesting. I trained for her interesting sounds the way other cadets trained for scores, and over the weeks those sounds came more frequently. And the shape of my training began to change in ways that I could feel before I could fully articulate. She started speaking to me after sessions. Not long conversations. Seveth was not a person who used words generously, but the words she did use were precise and carefully chosen, and I wrote down every one of them in my notebook after she left. One evening, after a session in which I had held my own against a rated Calith cadet for 4 full minutes before losing, the longest I had lasted against rated competition, she said, "You are fighting like someone who has nothing to protect." I thought about that one for 3 days before I understood what she meant. A fighter with a system has something to protect. The system. Abandoning the system in the middle of a bout is a failure. I had no system to protect. I had principles and instincts and a notebook full of observations, but no rigid structure whose integrity I was invested in maintaining. That meant I could throw away any approach, the moment it stopped working, and try something else, without the hesitation that comes from the feeling that changing course mid-fight is an admission of defeat. The other cadets began to notice that my losses were changing, not disappearing, but changing in quality. Opponents who had been dismissing me in 30 seconds were now ending bouts in 90, then in 3 minutes. One Vreth cadet named Aerith, who had beaten me 5 times in a row, ended a sparring session on week 7 with a look on his face that I had not seen from an opponent before. It was not respect yet, it was attention. He was paying attention to me now in a way he had not been before, which meant I had become something he needed to think about, which was the first real step. Seveth afterwards said, "You moved differently today." I stopped trying to fight the way they do, I told her. "What are you fighting like now?" "Like myself," I said. She made the interesting sound. I was training alone in Ring 4 on a Wednesday evening in my 8th week when I first saw him. I did not know it was him at first. I registered the figure in the upper observation gallery, the way you register anything in your peripheral vision during focused work, as a shape, a presence, an environmental detail. I was working on a ground recovery drill, specifically on getting back to my feet from a disadvantaged position as fast as possible, while maintaining defensive posture, and I was running it over and over because it was the kind of thing that had to be instinct before it could be useful. I ran the drill for 40 minutes. When I finally stopped and looked up, the gallery was empty. He was there again on Thursday. I registered him the same way, peripheral, present, filing away for later. This time when I looked up, he was still there, and for a fraction of a second before he turned away, I saw his face. I had seen Drathic from a distance twice before, both times in the main corridor. He was easier to recognize than most Vreth because of the scar that ran along the left side of his neck from just below the jaw to the collarbone, a training injury from early in his career which he had declined to have medically smoothed out. Among Vreth, I later learned, visible scars were considered neither a mark of failure nor of pride. They were simply evidence of survival. He wore his the same way he wore everything else, without particular feeling about it. From the observation gallery, he looked at me the way I had been looking at my opponents for 8 weeks. Not with amusement, not with contempt, with the focused, neutral attention of someone taking an accurate measurement. I went back to my drill. He was there again the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. On my 9th week I beat Aerith. It was not a clean win. It was ugly and stretched and went 3 full rounds before I found the angle that worked, and when it was over I was breathing so hard that my vision was fogging slightly at the edges. But it was a win. Aerith sat across from me on the mat afterward and said nothing for a moment, and then he said, in the flat translation of his comm unit, "You should not have been able to do that." I told him I knew. He nodded once, like he was filing that information, and left. The barracks were different that evening. Nothing dramatic. Nobody congratulated me loudly or made a ceremony of it. But the quality of the silence in the room was different. The way the quality of light changes before a storm without anything you could point to. And name. Oren, who had put me on the floor in 11 seconds 9 weeks ago and had not spoken to me directly since, looked up from his equipment maintenance when I came in and said, "Arith is a third-year rated." I said I knew. He looked at me for a moment, then looked back at his equipment. That was all. But it was something. 2 days later, the message arrived. It came through the Academy's formal challenge system. Standard format, sender designation, challenge type, location, time, no preamble. No statement of intent or rank or record. Just 3 words. Tomorrow, ring 7. The sender designation was Drathic of the Morn Cluster. I sat with the message for a long time, not because I was afraid. I want to be precise about that. I sat with it because I was thinking, and thinking takes time if you do it properly. Ring 7 was not a training ring. Ring 7 was the primary combat floor, the arena at the center of the station that was used for official challenges, formal exhibitions, and end-of-term championships. Requesting Ring 7 for a challenge was a statement in itself. It meant the challenger intended the bout to be witnessed, recorded, and entered into the permanent record. Drathic was not asking me to a training session. He was asking me to a formal bout on the most visible floor in the facility, against a human cadet who had been at the station for 9 weeks, and whose win total could be counted on one hand, with the full record of his 11 years of victories behind him. I picked up my notebook. I opened it to a fresh page. I wrote the date at the top. Then I wrote 3 words beneath it. He wants to know. Not to defeat me. He could defeat me in his sleep. He wanted to understand the thing he had been watching from the gallery. The thing that should not have been able to beat Aerith. The thing that laughed during drills. The thing that filled notebooks and came back to the floor every single time. I accepted the challenge. Then I started preparing with the calm, precise focus of someone who is not afraid and knows it, and finds that lack of fear to be the most useful tool in her kit. Seveth, when I told her, looked at me without expression for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "Good. Train harder tonight than you have ever trained in your life." I did. I did not sleep much. What sleep I got was deep and dreamless, the sleep of a person who has made a decision and is done second-guessing it. When I woke, the station's recycled air smelled different somehow, sharper, more present. I lay still for a moment in the dark, listening to the quiet breathing of the barracks, and I thought about a town in northern England where it rained more days than it did not, and about a girl who had never once been afraid of things bigger than her. I got up, I laced my boots, I checked my notebook one last time. I was ready. The corridor outside Ring 7 was already crowded when I arrived. That surprised me, not the size of the crowd itself, but how far back it stretched. The main approach corridor to the arena was wide enough for 12 beings to walk abreast, and it was full, wall to wall, all the way from the junction 50 meters back to the arena entrance. Cadets, instructors, senior staff, visiting researchers. Beings of a dozen species standing shoulder to shoulder in a space that was suddenly not large enough for the weight of the occasion. They parted to let me through, not quickly, not cheerfully, but they parted, and the movement of the crowd as I walked down that corridor was the strangest thing I had experienced since arriving on the station, because it was not the parting of people making way for someone they respected. It was the parting of people making way for something they did not know how to categorize. I was the variable that did not fit the model, and the crowd's body language said that clearly, and I walked through it with my chin level and my kit bag over but one shoulder, and my notebook in my back pocket. I had been inside Ring 7 once before, alone, in the middle of a quiet afternoon when no sessions were scheduled. I had wanted to see it without an audience, to understand the space on its own terms. It was a wide, circular floor of compressed synthetic material that absorbed impact well, surrounded by tiered seating that rose steeply on all sides up to the observation level. The floor was marked with a simple perimeter ring and a center point. Nothing else, no zones, no divisions. The simplicity was deliberate. This ring was not designed for points. It was designed for resolution. I had stood at the center of it that afternoon and looked up at the empty of seats and thought about every person who had stood in exactly this position before me, knowing that each one had a story and each story had an outcome, and that the outcomes, collectively, had built the record that made this floor significant. History is made in specific places, and the specific places carry the weight of it afterward. I had felt the weight of Ring 7 when it was empty. Standing in it now with the crowd filling the tiers above me, the weight was different, not heavier, more present, more alive. I walked out onto the floor alone. I set my bag down at the edge of the perimeter, checked my hand wraps, rolled my shoulders once, and looked around at the crowd filing into the seats above. Thousands of eyes. Thousands of faces representing physiologies I could not fully read, expressing things in the specific registers of their own species that my human pattern recognition could only partially decode. But I did not need to fully decode it to understand the general shape of what I was seeing. I was the newcomer, the short-lived species, the organism the intake scanner had not recognized, the cadet who had been at this station for 9 weeks, and whose arrival had generated a betting pool. I was the thing that was not supposed to be here, standing at the center of the most significant ring in the facility, waiting for the being who had never lost in this room. I noticed Siveth in the upper gallery. She was standing rather than sitting, which was unusual for her, her arms crossed in the way they were when she was paying full attention. She did not acknowledge me. She was watching the floor with the focused stillness of someone who has been in the room for events of consequence before, and knows how to be present without imposing. Cal, the maintenance worker who had told me about the betting pool in my first week, was in the front row of the lower tier. I recognized him by his uniform and his build. He was sitting with his hands on his knees and he was watching me with an expression that was very uncomplicated for the circumstances. It was hope, the uncomplicated direct hope of someone who does not have a stake in the outcome except in the way every person has a stake when they want a particular thing to happen. I gave him a brief nod. He straightened slightly in his seat. I felt alive in a way that is difficult to explain without sounding like I am making too much of a moment. There is a particular quality to the feeling of being exactly where you chose to be, doing exactly what you decided to do, with full knowledge of the risk and no wish to be anywhere else. It is not comfortable. It is better than comfortable. It is the feeling of being completely present. I had felt it a few times before in my life, at moments when everything became sharp and clear, and the noise in my head went quiet. I felt it standing in the center of Ring 7 with the crowd assembling above me and the arena lights steady overhead. I was still feeling it when Drathik walked in. The shift in the crowd's energy was immediate and physical. It was not noise. In fact, it was almost the opposite of noise, a kind of collective intake of breath that produced a brief, dense silence before the ambient sound returned. He came through the main entrance on the far side of the floor, and he walked to the center of the ring, the way things move, when they are never uncertain about their own strength. He was every inch what the story said. 7 feet of structured muscle and controlled power, with a characteristic, Vreth forearm build that meant he had twice the reach options of a 2-armed fighter, and the scar below his jaw that he wore without feeling. His pheromone signature preceded him by several meters. I could not read it, but I watched the non-human cadets in the front rows of the seating physically respond to it, some pulling back slightly, some going still with a kind of automatic alertness that went below conscious thought. He reached the center of the ring and stopped 3 meters from me. He looked at me. I looked at him. For a moment, neither of us moved. The arena was very quiet. Then he began the Vreth pre-fight declaration. I had read about the practice in the briefing documents I had been given before arriving at the station, so I understood what it was and what it meant. A recitation of record and achievement, delivered to an opponent before a formal bout, intended to establish the scale of what they were facing. It was not bravado in the human sense. It was closer to the formal reading of a contract or the statement of terms before a negotiation. It was a tradition that carried weight because every word in it was documented and verified. You could not lie in a Vreth pre-fight declaration without disgracing your entire record. Drathek's translation comm was set to broadcast, so the entire arena heard it in simultaneous rendering across all present species. He spoke for 4 minutes. 11 years of undefeated record across all categories of formal competition. 6 opponents previously considered unbreakable. 3 standing compact records. The precise number of formal challenges he had accepted and the outcome of every one. When he finished, the arena was very still. He had delivered the declaration without drama or variation in tone, which made it somehow more impressive than if he had performed it. It was simply true, and the truth of it filled the room. He waited. The traditional response to a pre-fight declaration was formal acknowledgement, a bow or the species equivalent, indicating that the opponent had heard and understood. It was the formal beginning of the bout. He was waiting for my fear. I could see it in the quality of his attention, the slight recalibration in his posture, the readiness to receive my reaction. Every previous opponent had given him something in that moment, a tell, a shift, something that showed the declaration had landed the way it was designed to. I looked at him for 1 more second. Then I grinned. It was not a small grin. It was the particular grin that I had been told since childhood was too wide for the context, too much. The grin my father had and that I had inherited. The grin that arrived when things became genuinely interesting. It spread across my face naturally, without effort, without performance. Because it was real. I was genuinely, deeply glad to be standing in that ring at that moment, and my face said so, and there was nothing in Drathek's 11 years of competitive record that had prepared him for an opponent who responded to his formal declaration of absolute superiority with the expression of someone who had just been handed a gift. I said, "I am not afraid, not loudly, not with performance, just clearly, in a tone that carried across the quiet of the arena." 3 words that were not a formal response in the Vreth tradition, but that said, plainly and completely, everything I needed to say. The silence that followed had a different texture than the silence before. Something moved through the crowd that was not quite sound, a collective shift, a recalibration that went through thousands of bodies at once. I felt it as a change in air pressure, or something close to it. Drathek looked at me for 2 full seconds. Something crossed his face that I could not name in Vreth terms, but that I recognized in a more fundamental way. It was the expression of a person who has just encountered something they did not account for. A variable outside the model. He was a being of extraordinary precision, and precision requires accurate models, and in this moment his model had a gap in it, and he was looking directly at the gap. Then the bout began. He was faster than I had modeled. I want to be clear about that. I had studied every recording of his bouts that the Thisgen's archive held. I had worked with Siveth to build a movement profile. I had run response drills designed specifically around his technique. And he was still faster than I had modeled. His first combination came in the opening 2 seconds. And it came from a direction and angle that was technically legal, but that required a level of spatial coordination that I had underestimated. I caught the edge of the first strike. The second landed clean on my left side. I went down. The arena made a sound. I heard it the way you hear things when you are temporarily reorganizing your relationship with the floor. I pushed up, got one knee under me, got both feet under me, and stood. The world cleared quickly, faster than it should have probably, which I put down to the same thing the intake officer had noted on day 1. I was standing. Drathek had moved back half a step. He was watching me with the stillness of a being in the process of recalculating. In 11 years, I would later learn, the pattern of his bouts had been consistent. Opponents he struck in the opening seconds did not get up with the speed I had just demonstrated. The physical data he had gathered from 2 weeks of observation had told him what I could do. The thing it had not told him was what I would do after taking the opening of his best combination at full impact and standing back up in under 3 seconds. He attacked again. The exchange lasted longer this time, nearly 40 seconds. I blocked better, moved better, found a rhythm in his pattern that was not quite a vulnerability but was the edge of one. He adapted mid-exchange, shifting the angle of his second approach in a way that demonstrated exactly why his record was what it was. He put me down a second time with a technique I had not seen on any of the recordings. Something new, something held in reserve, something that confirmed that what he had shown on film was not his complete capability. I got up again. My left side was burning. I noted it, filed it in the back of the queue, with everything else that was not immediately relevant, and brought my full attention back to the 3 meters of floor between us. The crowd was very quiet now. Not the quiet of shock. The quiet of concentrated attention. The absolute absence of noise that happens when an audience stops anticipating an outcome and starts genuinely watching what is in front of them. I heard nothing from the tiers above. I heard nothing from the entry corridor. The entire station, or the part of it in that arena, was simply watching. The third exchange was when things changed. I had been in the bout for 3 minutes. I was operating on a recovery curve and a pain tolerance that the whole room could observe and measure. Drathek came at me for the 3rd time with a variation of his opening combination, modified, adapted, the way no fighter at this level repeats himself without adjustment. And I did something that I had not planned. I had not decided to do it in training, had not run it as a drill, had not included it in any of the preparation sessions with Siveth. It arrived in that 3rd minute the way the best things arrive. From the place where instinct and information have been cooking long enough to produce something entirely new. I laughed, not from pain, I want to be precise about that. Not a nervous sound, not a sound of bravado or performance, not a sound designed to communicate anything to the crowd. It was genuine. In that 3rd minute, with my left side burning, and my opponent coming at me for the 3rd time, with a modified combination built from the most refined Vreth combat tradition in the known galaxy, I felt the particular joy that comes from being in a fight that is actually a good fight. A fight that asks everything of you. A fight that is testing you in exactly the way you needed to be tested. And my body expressed it the only way it knew how. Drathek stopped. Not fully. Not long enough to call it a pause in any formal sense. But for a fraction of a second that was long enough to matter. The fluid continuous motion of a fighter, executing a designed sequence, was interrupted by something his system had no category for. He had fought beings who shouted, who went silent, who drove themselves forward in desperation. He had never fought a being who laughed. In the middle of his combination, in the third minute of a bout against an opponent who had been put on the floor twice, with what looked, and was, like genuine happiness, his rhythm broke. I moved. What I did in the next 40 seconds was not technical in any way a coach would diagram on a board. It was built from fragments. A ground recovery movement I had drilled 800 times, an angle of entry that I had watched Sivith demonstrate once, and absorbed without fully knowing I had absorbed it, and something else that was entirely mine. A fluid transition between positions that made no formal sense within any combat system I had studied, but that worked because Drathek was in the one moment in 11 years when his certainty had a crack in it, and I fit myself into that crack with everything I had. He went down. The formal submission marker required sustained control in a defined position, held for a count of 5. 4 times in those 5 seconds he shifted, adjusted, searched for the exit, searching the same way I had been searching for solutions since day one, with the systematic intelligence of a complete fighter trying to solve a new problem. I held the position. I held it because I had been training my grip strength for 9 weeks, in a station full of beings who had never thought to train theirs. Because grip strength was considered a secondary attribute by most compact fighters who relied on speed and precision rather than sustained force. I held it because the same hands that had documented every loss in 2 full notebooks were not going to let go now. At the count of 5, the bout lights shifted to amber. Submission confirmed. The arena did not immediately make the sound I expected. I had expected noise. I expected the burst of collective release that follows a significant result. What I got instead was the recalibrating silence. The silence I would come to understand as the sound of a room full of minds running new data against old models and finding the models needed significant revision. Thousands of beings sitting with the visual evidence of something outside their predictive framework. Something that should not have been possible by any measurement they knew how to take. I released the hold. I moved back. I stood. Ratdathik was still for a moment. Then he rose with the careful precision of someone taking stock of themselves. He stood across from me, and he looked at me, and the look was different from every look he had given me before. It was the look of a being who has encountered a genuinely new variable and is in the process of deciding how to relate to it. Not confusion, something more engaged than confusion. I looked back at him. I was breathing hard. My left side was making itself known in a way that suggested I would be visiting the medical unit shortly. I was aware of the crowd and the lights and the amber glow of the bout indicators. I was aware of all of it in the way you are present to things when the adrenaline is still moving through you and the world is sharp at every edge. I was still grinning. The medical unit was quieter than the arena. It was always quiet at that time of evening. The later shifts running on minimum staff. The diagnostic units cycling through their automated checks, with the steady soft rhythm of equipment doing its job without asking anything of anyone. I was the only patient, the attending medic, a Lethe with the precise unhurried manner of someone who had treated injuries long enough to feel no urgency about any of them. Ran the scanner over my left side and confirmed what I already suspected. 3 fractured ribs, a dislocated left shoulder that had been relocated by the ring medics during the post-bout check, but that would need a week of careful movement, and a collection of deep bruising along my right forearm and thigh that the scanner logged with the flat detachment of a system that did not assign meaning to physical damage. I lay on the diagnostic table and stared at the ceiling and let my body report everything it had been waiting to say. Since the third exchange in the ring, it was a long report. I did not mind. I had a notebook and a working hand, and I used them. I wrote down every exchange in the bout in the order it happened, from the first combination to the final hold. I wrote what worked and what did not work, and what I had not planned but had done anyway, and what had resulted from it. I wrote about the moment his rhythm broke. I wrote about the sound that broke it, and what it told me about the gap between instinct and calculation, at the highest level of competition. I wrote about the grip strength in the ground recovery drill and the fragment of Seveth's technique that I had, absorbed without knowing I had absorbed it. I wrote about the laugh, what it was and what it was not, and why it had worked not as a technique but as a truth. I filled 11 pages. Then I closed the notebook and lay still for a while. The medical unit had a small window that looked out onto an interior corridor. I could see the lights of the corridor on their night cycle, dim to the low amber that meant the station was in its rest period. The station did not sleep exactly, but it had rhythms, cycles of activity and stillness that gave the days a shape. I had been here 9 weeks, and the rhythms had become familiar, in the way that any place becomes familiar when you are paying attention. I knew the timing of the maintenance crews and the shift changes in the training rings and the specific quality of the station's recycled air at different hours. The medic who had done my initial assessment returned to check the diagnostic readouts before leaving for the shift change. She reviewed the scanner output for a moment, and then looked at me with the expression that I recognized now as the version of surprise that trained medical professionals allow themselves when they think the patient is not watching. "Your rib tissue is already beginning calcification response," she said, "at a rate approximately double the projected curve for your species. Is that a problem?" I asked. It was the same question I had asked the intake officer on day 1. She looked at me the way the intake officer had looked at me. "No," she said. And then, after a pause, "Actually, I am not certain. I would like to run a follow-up scan tomorrow morning." I said that was fine. She noted something in her records and left. I lay in the quiet and thought about the first time I had been injured badly enough to require a medical assessment, which had been at age 14 when I had come off a motorbike on a gravel road outside the town and broken 2 bones in my left hand. The doctor at the small clinic had looked at the scan and said that my bone density was unusual for my age and body type, and that she would note it in my file. I had not thought much about it at the time. I was 14, and the more interesting question had been how to explain the motorbike to my father. Standing in a galaxy that was, for the first time, beginning to seriously consider what a human actually was, that memory felt different. Every species in this compact had been catalogued and studied and assessed. Their biology was documented. Their capabilities were mapped. The compact had millennia of data on what a Calith could endure, what a Vreth could withstand, how a Lethe healed. Humans had been in the compact for less than a generation. The database entry for us was, comparatively, a first draft. I was thinking about all of this, about familiarity and belonging, and the long distance between a small town in northern England and a medical unit on the galaxy's oldest combat training station, when I heard the knock. Not the formal chime of a visitor check-in through the standard system, an actual knock, the kind made with a hand, or a hand equivalent, on the frame of an open door. I turned my head. Drathek stood at the entrance. He was still in his training clothes. He had not had anything medically attended to, which I noted. Either he had not sustained damage significant enough to require it, or he had decided this visit was more important. Either was plausible. He stood at the entrance and did not move into the room, in the manner of someone who has not been invited in and is observing that convention, deliberately. I looked at him for a moment. "Come in," I said. He came in. He stood near the foot of the diagnostic table in the posture that I had learned indicated a Vreth in neutral state. Not relaxed, because Vreth did not fully relax in the way humans did, but settled. Present. He looked at me for a moment without speaking, which was not uncomfortable because I was doing the same to him. Then he said, "Explain the sound." I knew immediately what he meant. Not a question asked from confusion. A question asked because the answer was important, and he had come here specifically to get it accurately rather than interpret it from the outside. "It was real," I said. "I was not performing it. I was not using it as a technique to disrupt you, though I understand that it functioned that way." I was genuinely happy in that moment. He processed this. "In the middle of a bout," he said. "Yes. Under physical duress. Against an opponent whose record you were fully aware of." "Yes." The silence stretched for a moment. I could see him working with the information, fitting it against frameworks that were not built to accommodate it. Drathek was a being of extraordinary precision, and precision requires accurate models, and the sound I had made in that ring did not fit any model he had built over 11 years of competition. He was not pretending to understand it. He was sitting with the fact that he did not understand it, which I thought said something significant about the kind of fighter he actually was. "That is not rational," he said. I thought about this carefully. "No," I agreed. "But humans are not always rational. We are adaptable, which is a different thing. Rational systems predict outcomes and optimize for them. Adaptable systems survive conditions they did not predict. We built our whole civilization doing things in conditions that our rational assessment said we should not survive. We are, as a species, the product of 10,000 years of doing things anyway. He was quiet for a long moment. The diagnostic unit beside me cycled through a routine check and beeped once softly and went quiet again. "You were afraid," he said. It was not a question. It was a stated observation, offered for confirmation. "Yes," I said. "I was afraid when I walked into that ring. I was afraid through most of the first exchange." "But you said you were not afraid." "I said I was not afraid in the way you were expecting me to be afraid," I said. "You were expecting my fear to stop me or to slow me, or to show in my movement in ways you could use. I have been afraid my whole life. Everything on Earth is bigger than a human, or faster or stronger, or more able to end us in ways we did not see coming. We are afraid of most of it, and we always have been. We built civilization while being afraid. We went to space while being afraid. I came here while being afraid. Fear is not the opposite of action for us. It is just a condition that is present at the same time as everything else." He looked at me for a long time. His expression moved through something I still could not fully decode in Vreth terms, but which had the quality, I thought, of genuine engagement with an unfamiliar idea, not dismissal, not discomfort. The active engagement of a mind that has been given something new and is turning it over carefully from every angle. "On Vreth," he said finally, "fear and action are considered incompatible states. A warrior who acts from fear is a warrior whose judgment is compromised. We train to eliminate fear responses before entering formal competition. A fear response in a bout is a failure of preparation." "I know," I said. "I read about it before I arrived." "You did not train to eliminate your fear response." "No. I trained to keep moving while it was present, to make the decision that this other thing, the action, the problem in front of me, was more important than the fear, not to silence the fear, to hold both things at the same time and keep going." He was quiet for a long time. The corridor outside the medical unit window was amber-lit and empty. The station's night cycle ran without interruption. "The hold at the end," he said. "Yes, I searched for the exit for the full 5 seconds. I found it twice and lost it both times. I want to understand what you did at the second adjustment." This was not a question about the sound. This was a question from one fighter to another about technique, asked with the precision of someone who takes accurate information seriously enough to ask for it directly even when asking required a kind of acknowledgement. I respected it. "Grip rotation at the wrist, about 20 degrees counterclockwise from the standard position," I said. "It puts the primary pressure point in a slightly different location. Narrower, but harder to counter with the standard shoulder drive because it changes the angle of maximum leverage." He processed this. "Where did you learn that?" "I did not learn it," I said. "I made it up in the ring." He looked at me for a moment, in the moment. "Yes." He nodded once slowly, the nod of someone filing accurate data in the right place. Something settled in his posture. Not a dramatic shift. A small one, the kind of micro-adjustment that means something has been accepted, filed, integrated. He reached into the side pocket of his training jacket and took out something small and set it on the edge of the diagnostic table near my uninjured arm. I looked at it. It was a small flat disc of dark metal with a marking along one edge in a script I did not recognize. "An honor scar token," he said. "In Vreth tradition, it is given between fighters of equal standing. It is not given for winning. It is given for earning the right to stand in the same ring as someone who has spent their life becoming what they are." I looked at the token for a moment. Then I looked at him. "You have never given one before," I said. "No," he said. I picked it up. It was heavier than its size suggested, warm from being in his pocket, with the weight of something made to endure. I turned it once between my fingers. "Thank you," I said. He nodded once, the compact, precise nod of a formal exchange completed. He moved toward the door. At the entrance he stopped without turning. "You will receive more challenges," he said. "After today, there will be many who want to understand what they saw. Fighters who have built their records on knowing how every variable behaves. You are a variable they have no model for. That will make some of them curious. It will make others uncomfortable. Both kinds will challenge you." A pause. "The briefest one." Then he left. I held the token for a long time in the quiet of the medical unit, feeling the weight of it. Outside in the station's network, the recording of the bout was already moving. I knew this without checking. The station was connected to every compact communications relay in the sector, and what had happened in Ring 7 was the kind of thing that moved fast. Not because upsets were rare, records ended, that was not unusual, but the laugh would travel. The 3-second recovery. The grin given to a pre-fight declaration designed to break something before it started. That would travel. By the time I was discharged from medical 3 hours later, my formal challenge registration had 6 new entries. I walked the corridor back toward Barrack 7, and the station felt different around me. Not dramatically. not as though lights had changed or sounds had shifted, but the way a room feels different after a significant decision has been made in it, carrying the weight of something that happened there. Beings in the corridor moved differently around me now. Before, it had been the movement of beings making way for an unknown variable. Now it was the movement of beings making way for something that had been observed, measured, and had exceeded every measurement taken. There was a Vreth maintenance worker repairing a ceiling conduit near the junction of the main corridor. She paused her work when I passed and looked down at me from the elevated platform with an expression I could not fully decode, across species but which my human pattern recognition filed as something in the direction of reassessment. She did not speak. Neither did I, but the quality of the look stayed with me down the corridor and around the corner. A group of younger cadets, first weeks by the look of their uniforms, and the way they moved, were clustered near the water station, outside the junior training wing. They went quiet when they saw me coming. Not in the way the room had gone quiet on my first evening in Barrack 7, the silence of people deciding not to invest attention in something unlikely to pay off. This silence had a different texture. It was the silence of people who had seen the recording and were now seeing the person from the recording, and were trying to reconcile the two. I was not going to stop and give them speech. That was not what the moment needed, and it was not who I was. I kept walking, but as I passed, I caught the eye of one of them, a young Calith cadet with the new exoskeleton brightness that indicated early adolescence by their species biology, and I gave her a nod. The direct, level nod that my father had taught me for situations where words were not the right tool, but acknowledgement was. She blinked, then she nodded back. I kept walking. Cavith, who had told me on day 4 to focus on surviving my first month, passed me near the barracks junction. He slowed. He held my gaze for a moment in the way that means something even across the gap of species. The nod that is not quite a nod but carries the same weight. Then he kept walking. I put my hand in my jacket pocket and felt the disc there, solid and warm. The station's air recyclers hummed at the frequency I had come to recognize as the late cycle shift. The corridor lights were on their evening setting, gold-tinted and long-shadowed. Somewhere in the older sections of the station, in the rings where the next generation of the galaxy's fighters were working through their evening drills, the steady sound of training continued without interruption. I kept walking. I had work to do in the morning. I had 6 challenges in the queue and a shoulder that needed a week of careful movement and a notebook that was nearly full. I needed to start a third one. I thought, as I walked, about a conversation I had with my mother before I left Earth for the last time. She had not tried to talk me out of it. She was not that kind of person. She had sat across from me at the kitchen table with her hands around a cup of tea, and she had looked at me for a long time. And then she had said, "You know what you are doing and why you are doing it, so go and do it properly." That was all. It was enough. It was more than enough. I had carried it the whole way here, across the distance between a kitchen table in northern England and a medical unit on a station orbiting a star, so far from Earth that its light had not yet reached the town where I grew up. It fit in my pocket alongside the honor scar token. Weightless, the way the most important things are weightless. Present the way the most important things are present. I reached the barracks junction and turned toward home, which was what Barracks 7 had become, without my noticing the exact moment it happened. Home is not always a place you recognize until you are already living in it. I pushed open the door and went in. I stood in the council chamber and understood for the first time what it felt like to be genuinely examined by the oldest, most experienced military minds in the known galaxy. Not assessed the way the academy instructors assessed cadets, with the professional distance of people evaluating a recruit. Examined the way you examine something you have just discovered and are still deciding whether to classify as a discovery or a complication. There were 11 of them around the table. The Galactic Compact Security Council convened in a chamber near the top of Vathara Station's oldest section, where the architecture was the original construction, all right angles and heavy alloy, and nothing added for comfort or aesthetics. The ceiling was high, and the light was flat, and the table was a long oval of dark material that absorbed rather than reflected. I was standing. No one had offered me a chair, and I had not asked for one. The summons had come 2 days after the bout. Priority urgent classification. My academy liaison had handed me the notification, with an expression that suggested she was genuinely uncertain how to contextualize it. The council member who opened the session was a Calith elder named Counselor Thresh. She had the particular quality of authority that comes not from rank alone, but from decades of decisions that turned out to be right, a quality that came across clearly even across the gap of species. She said, "Cadet Novak, you have been at this facility for 9 weeks. In that time you have recorded a formal victory against a rated cadet and a formal challenge victory against the facility's standing champion. The recording of the second bout has been accessed by 47 military research institutions, 12 diplomatic offices, and 3 heads of state within the compact in the 2 days since the event. We would like to understand what we are looking at. I stood with my hands at my sides and thought about the best way to answer that. You are looking at a human, I said. Thresh looked at me steadily. That is not a sufficient answer. It is the only accurate one, I said. What you are trying to determine is whether what happened in Ring 7 is a property of me specifically or a property of humans in general. The answer is both. I trained for 9 weeks with a focus on human adaptive capacity. But the raw material I was working with, the pain tolerance, the real-time improvisation, the ability to function alongside fear rather than requiring its absence, those are not personal attributes. They are species attributes. Every human you will ever encounter carries them. The council member on Thresh's left, a Vreth elder whose designation I had been given in my briefing notes as Counselor Marev, leaned forward slightly. The question before this council, he said, is not a celebratory one. 47 military research institutions accessed that recording, 12 diplomatic offices. What they were assessing, Cadet Novakic, was whether humanity represents a strategic risk to the current balance within the compact. I had been expecting this. I had thought about it during the 2 days between the summons and this meeting, lying awake in the medical unit and then in the barracks, turning it over carefully from every angle I could construct. No, I said. Explain your confidence, Marev said. Humans are not a threat to the species of the compact, I said. We are a threat to the idea that the outcome of a contest is determined before it begins. We are a threat to the assumption that superior size, speed, and historical record make a result inevitable. We are a threat to anyone who enters a situation against a human having already decided that the situation is resolved. I paused to let that land before continuing, but that is not a threat to the compact. It is an argument for having us inside it. A compact that includes humanity is a compact that has on its side the one quality no model or combat system can fully replicate: the willingness to keep going past the point where continued effort appears rational. One of the other council members, a Lethia elder whose name I had been given as Counselor Veth, spoke for the first time. His voice came through the translation system with the particular smoothness that indicated a very precise speaker. You describe an asset, he said. Others in this chamber would describe what they saw in that recording as an unpredictable element. Unpredictable elements can be as damaging to allies as to opponents. True, I said. Any capability strong enough to disrupt an opponent's model will also create uncertainty in an ally's model. That is not an argument against the capability. That is an argument for investing the time to understand it. I looked at the table, at the 11 faces around it, which is, I think, precisely why you called me here. Thresh's expression shifted by a fraction, not quite a smile, something in the direction of acknowledgement. A council member I had not yet heard from, seated at the far end of the table, a being whose species I could not immediately identify, whose biology suggested something between Calith and Vreth in structure, but with the dark, banded coloring of neither, spoke in a voice that came through the translation system with a slight delay, as though the system was working harder than usual. We have reviewed the footage from the training observation gallery as well, the period prior to the formal challenge, your sessions over the preceding 2 weeks. I waited. You were aware of being watched. The council member said. Yes, I said. You continued your drills without modification. Yes. Why? I thought about this for a moment. Because modification would have been performance, I said. And performance is not information. Whatever Drathic was gathering from watching me, I wanted it to be accurate. I was not trying to deceive him. I was trying to give him a true picture and let him make a true decision about what he was looking at, the same way I would want a true picture if I were the one watching. The room was quiet for a moment. The council member at the far end looked at me for a long time. Then he looked down at his records. He said nothing more. Thresh said, "We will review the full record of your time at the Academy. There are also representatives from the Compact's Joint Strategic Division who will wish to speak with you in coming weeks. You are dismissed, Cadet Novak." I inclined my head in the formal acknowledgement I had learned for Calith elders. I turned and walked to the chamber exit. At the door I paused, not because I had planned to, but because something occurred to me that seemed worth saying. "Counselor Thresh," I said. She looked at me. "The betting pool on the station gave me 3 weeks," I said. "I have been here 9. The Compact may want to update its models accordingly." I did not wait for her response. I walked back through the old corridor with its heavy alloy walls, and I breathed the recycled air of the station, and I thought about how different that air felt from the air of the town where I grew up. Not worse, not better, just larger. The weeks after the council meeting moved differently from the weeks before it. Not slower, not faster, with more weight. Every training session had more people in the observation gallery than it had before the bout. Not students observing casually. Fighters, actual fighters. People who competed and trained at a serious level, watching not from curiosity or dismissal but from the specific attention of someone who wants to understand a technique they have never seen before and cannot quite categorize. I noticed it and said nothing about it and trained as I always had, which was as hard and as honestly as I could manage. The 6 challenge requests were processed through the formal system over the following month. I accepted all of them. 3 I won, 2 I lost. 1 was declared a draw by the ring arbiter when the time limit expired with neither fighter having achieved submission. Every bout was recorded and every recording traveled through the compact networks, and each one added something to the picture that had begun with the laugh in the 3rd minute of a fight that everyone in that arena had expected to be over in 30 seconds. The losses were not failures. That is not how I experienced them, and it is not how I recorded them. Each loss was a dataset, a map of a gap between where I was and where I needed to be. I had 2 full notebooks of exactly those maps, and I knew how to use them. I wrote down the losses the same way I wrote down the wins, in the same neutral, careful detail, noting what worked and what did not, and what the opponent had done that I had not fully accounted for. I would not make the same mistakes twice. I would make new mistakes which were more useful. Seveth continued our sessions every morning. She began adding things to the training that she had not introduced before, techniques and approaches she had apparently been holding in reserve for a student who was ready for them, and the fact that she was offering them to me now said more than her words alone ever quite managed. She was not generous with words. She was generous with time and attention, which is the more valuable currency, and I knew how to receive both. One morning she arrived at the ring 5 minutes early, which she had never done before. I was already there, working through warm-up drills. She watched me for a while without speaking. "You have stopped trying to prove anything," she said. "I thought about this. I think that is right," I said. "When did that change?" "Somewhere in week 5, I said. I realized that proving something required an audience. I was not here for the audience. I was here for the work." She made the interesting sound and we began the session. Drathik and I trained in adjacent rings on Tuesday evenings. Not together, not yet, but adjacent, both of us aware of the other's presence. Both of us occasionally pausing to observe the other's work, in the way that fighters observe, when they respect what they are watching. We did not talk often. When we did, the conversations were brief and precise and more honest than most conversations I had on the station, because there was nothing to perform between us. We had been in that ring together, and after something like that, performance is beside the point. He told me once, after a Tuesday session, that the honor scar token he had given me was the first one his family had produced in his generation, that his father and his mother had each received one in their careers, and that the family tradition held that the token was earned, never given lightly, never taken back. I told him that in the town where I grew up there was a tradition of giving someone your best coat if they needed it more than you did. That generosity of the most direct kind was considered the highest form of acknowledgement. He considered this for a moment and said that the traditions were perhaps not so different. I said I thought he was right. He asked me once what I had felt in the moment before the grin, before the 3 words. Not what I had thought, what I had felt. I told him honestly. I felt the particular relief that comes when you stop waiting for permission to be exactly who you are. That standing in that ring with his declaration still in the air, I had understood in a very direct way that no one was going to give me permission to be here, and that was fine because I had not come here waiting for permission. I had come here because I chose to, and the grin was what choosing looks like on my face. He was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, "I do not think I have ever made a choice of that kind." "What kind have you made?" I asked. "Decisions," he said. "Calculated from available information, optimized for outcomes, but a choice in the way you describe, where the deciding factor is simply that you wanted to and you could. I do not think I have done that." "You gave me the token," I said. He paused. "Yes," he said. And then after a moment, "Yes, I did." We both went back to our respective rings, but the conversation stayed with me, and I thought about it later that night in the barracks, lying awake in the dark with the starfield outside the window, and the station's night cycle hum around me, thinking about the gap between decisions and choices and what it means to be a species that made its reputation on the latter. I went back to Ring 7 in the evening, after the day's sessions had ended and the floor was empty. I had been given priority access as of the challenge outcome, which was standard protocol. The arena was quiet, the overhead lights on the low maintenance setting, the tiered seating empty and dark. I walked out to the center of the floor. I stood on the center point. I turned a slow circle, looking up at the empty seats. I thought about the 11 people who had sat in that council chamber and tried to decide whether I was a variable or a threat or an asset. I thought about the token in my pocket. I thought about Seveth, who had said that morning, without preamble, "The council summons is a measurement. You measured well. Do not let it become the whole story." I thought about the 6 challenges in the queue that had now become a longer queue. I thought about the 3 wins and the 2 losses and the draw, and about what each one had taught me, and what each one had taught the beings on the other side of the bout, and what the aggregate of all of it was teaching the 47 research institutions, and the 12 diplomatic offices, and the 3 heads of state who were watching a human cadet navigate the oldest combat training station in the known galaxy one bout at a time. I sat down on the center point of Ring 7, cross-legged, and I took out my notebook, the 3rd one. I had filled the first 2 and was 60 pages into the 3rd. I turned to a fresh page. I sat for a moment with the pen in my hand, feeling the weight of the station around me, the weight of everything that had happened in 9 weeks, the weight of everything that was still coming. Then I wrote 3 words at the top of the page. Tomorrow, Ring 7. I looked at the words for a moment. Then I wrote one more line below them, something that had not been in Drathek's original message, something that was mine alone. I am the challenger now. I closed the notebook. I stayed in the quiet of the empty arena for a while longer, letting the silence settle around me the way silence does when a space has seen things and knows how to hold them. Outside, through the station's hull and the vacuum beyond it, the stars were old and cold and immense. Between them, in the communications channels of the Galactic Compact, 47 military research institutions, and 12 diplomatic offices and 3 heads of state were watching a recording of a human cadet laugh in the middle of the hardest fight of her life and win anyway. They were all asking the same question. What do humans do that no other species does? The answer was in 3 notebooks and 9 weeks of losses that became a win. The answer was in the weight of a metal disc in a jacket pocket. The answer was in the grin given to a pre-fight declaration designed to end something before it began. We are not the strongest species in this galaxy. We are not the fastest or the oldest or the most feared. We have no natural armor. We do not communicate faster than language. Our recorded history, measured against the compact, is barely a sentence. We are the ones who keep showing up, who take the hit and stand back up and note down exactly what hit us, and come back tomorrow with something new, who find in the middle of impossible situations not paralysis but the quiet, stubborn, sometimes unreasonable pleasure of being exactly where we chose to be, doing exactly what we decided to do. In a universe this large, with this many species and this many centuries of recorded history, it turns out that particular quality is genuinely rare, rare enough to be noticed, rare enough to matter. I stood up from the center of Ring 7. I picked up my notebook. I walked to the edge of the floor and picked up my kit bag and slung it over my shoulder, and the familiar weight of it settled against me like a thing that belonged there. I had challenges to prepare for. I had training with Seveth in the morning. I had a shoulder that was almost fully recovered, and a left side that no longer reported in with complaints and a notebook that still had pages in it. I had a long way to go. I knew that clearly. 9 weeks against 11 years was a beginning, not an ending. One victory against a record that spanned a decade was not a career. It was a first sentence. The rest of the story was still being written, one bout, and one notebook page and one Tuesday in an adjacent ring at a time. But beginnings were exactly the thing I knew how to work with. I walked out of Ring 7 and into the corridor, and the station opened up ahead of me, the way it always did, vast and complicated and full of beings who were all, in their various ways, trying to become something worth being. I kept walking. There was work to do.